Hello again. Welcome to our review video number 2. Today we're going to just do a quick recap on the second unit we looked at this year, which is the French regime. Let's get started. So let's get started here. So in Unit 2, which is also known as the Society of New France, we're going to look at the time period between 1534 all the way up until 1760. So around 1534 is where we start, and that is the arrival of the Europeans. Next, we're going to be discussing the whole idea of setting up colonies. So there were two types of colonies that the French were looking to set up, and they were trading colonies, but there was also the idea of permanently setting up a colony, which is called a settlement colony. Then they began to discuss ways in which they could grow their population, and we're also going to be looking at some of the political structure, which of course includes France establishing a royal government. Some of the other things that we might look at is also just the social hierarchy of New France at that time. So let's get started. Okay, so let's start off with the arrival of the Europeans. So the first one we'll look at is Jacques Cartier. So Jacques Cartier was a French explorer, and the King of France sent him on a number of voyages. He first was sent out in 1534 to find gold as well as precious metals, but also to find a new trade route. Jacques Cartier was unsuccessful of these objectives in 1534. However, he did come in contact with Aboriginal peoples who suggested that he could in fact find a new trade route to Asia. And so when he returned to France, he told the king of this, and the king granted him a second voyage. This time, he returned to the New World, where he found the St. Lawrence River. However, he was mistaken. I'm speaking, of course, about Jacques Cartier. He was mistaken because he thought the St. Lawrence River was actually the new trade route to Asia. However, he was very wrong, and he reached Hochelaga, which was what we know as Montreal. But he couldn't go any further because of the Lachine Rapids, and so he was forced then to change his course, and he ended up getting stuck in a place known as Stadacona, which was Quebec City. They were stuck there for the winter, and a number of his crewmen died. So by 1541, the King of France ordered a third voyage with Cartier, and this time he added two objectives, not just to find gold in a trade route, but this time to actually evangelize these Aboriginal peoples and to also establish a settlement colony. While he was sent there for his third voyage, he actually brought over a gentleman known as Roberval, who took charge of the colony in the New World. Anyways, point being is that when Cartier went on his third mission, he actually set a camp up near Quebec City, which was known as Stadacona, and he believed he had actually discovered some very precious diamonds. So he returned back to France to show his discovery, which ended up not being anything other than some pyrite, which is not diamonds or at all. And in the end, the person that had been there, who was Roberval, his expedition had failed as well. So France was very, very discouraged with this. And so all of these setbacks and all the mistakes led to France abandoning their exploration of the St. Lawrence Valley. They didn't resume their exploration actually until the 16th century, until much, much later. Okay, so while France didn't really achieve their goal early on, it took them a little while to return back to the St. Lawrence Valley. In fact, it took until the late 16th century. Beginning in the 16th century, you began to see European fishers now venture as far as Newfoundland, just off the shores of what would one day become Canada, fishing for cod. But by being so close to the land, what they ended up doing is these Europeans came into contact with the Aboriginals, and what they started doing was trading fish for pelts, beaver pelts. And what that really started was something known as the fur trade. The French saw the fur trade as a really good way to accumulate wealth. So what they would do, obviously, is they would go and trade with the Aboriginals. New France would then send furs back to France. France would turn those furs into hats or consumer goods for the European countries. European countries would then pay France in gold. So the fur trade was a very, very effective way for them to begin to accumulate wealth. Of course, the whole process of accumulating as much gold as you can, because that was a sign of wealth, was a process known as mercantilism. So, based on this fur trade exchange between the French and the Aboriginals, you really just began to see trading posts being set up, also known as trading colonies. And so the New World to France was really just a way of making money. But in doing so, you began to see there was an alliance that was created between the Aboriginals and the French. And because of this alliance, you began to see a much more favorable condition for France to set up permanent colonies. And so the whole idea of being able to permanently settled started to become a reality around 1608 with the settlement of Quebec City by a man known as Samuel de Champlain. Okay, so he was the individual who set up the first permanent settlement because he found a favorable location for the French to start to settle. So once the French were able to permanently settle along the St. Lawrence and set up a permanent settlement, it was now time for them to understand that in order to successfully stay there, they had to grow their population. So Samuel de Champlain recognized that there were three groups that all had different interests. They weren't interested in settling for the same reason, but he knew that they were the church, the French government, and chartered companies or trading companies. So all three had different reasons, but those were really the three groups that were interested in growing population along the St. Lawrence. Okay, so here they are, and I think it goes without saying that the church, their strategy for growing the population was through evangelization, of course, which means the conversion of non-Catholics into the Catholic faith, or the Christian faith, I should say. And so the church, although it did this, it's got to be recognized that it really didn't do very well. In fact, it's, although their efforts were really, to drive home Christian beliefs amongst the indigenous peoples, their preaching really wasn't very successful. So during the French regime, that really didn't work. In terms of the government, which is also known as the state, well, theirs was kind of twofold, or really I should say threefold, meaning they kind of had like three strategies in place. So, the first one was they granted monopolies to chartered companies, right, which is the third one. So they gave companies monopolies, right? So they kind of gave these to chartered companies. And basically what that means is that they gave them full control over the fur trade, and they had sole ownership of it. But this really wasn't very good because the charter companies had certain sort of responsibilities for being given those monopolies. One was that they had to increase colonization, or the number of colonists, over a 15-year period. They needed to at least have 4,000 colonists, which they didn't do because really their main focus was just making money, not actually permanently settling or growing a population. So that didn't go well. The charter companies also had a lot of conflict with English-speaking companies that were also there. So there's a lot of conflict, which really hindered their ability. So the whole idea of the state giving monopolies really didn't work. Another thing that the state did was when the Jean Talon, who was the intendant at that time, developed the Filles du Roi. And this is actually kind of an interesting one because this is when all of those single women were sent over to the New World to really start families. And this one actually did work. Okay, the Filles du Roi did work. Natural birth rate went up, and so by 1776, you began to see the colony's birth rate actually increase. They got like 70,000 newborns. So that did work, but it took so long that yes, it worked, but it was just too slow. The government also really didn't give all that many commercial opportunities to people, and so that was, something they didn't do very well. So that's the state. Next, you have the chartered companies, and the chartered companies I've already talked about quite a bit, and chartered companies had monopolies, and they had responsibilities that they didn't adhere to, okay? It's also important to note that the state also took over chartered companies and created the Company of 100 Associates. So basically, when these companies didn't do their job well, the state intervened and took over it, and they created the Company of 100 Associates. And the Company of 100 Associates was established. And once again, the company of 100 Associates, even though it was under government sort of rule, they still had obligations like to also take part in evangelization of Aboriginal peoples, also to exploit natural resources in the territory, and of course to settle it permanently, of which they really didn't do a very good job. And so over the course of that period, you began to see the company of 100 Associates sort of dissipate, and it dissolved. Just on one final note about the company of 100 Associates, they accumulated a ton of debt because they were being attacked quite frequently by English rivals. And so to pay its debts, the company of 100 Associates actually decided to lease its monopoly to other traders, and in return, the other traders had the obligation of settling the colony. So they had to carry a certain number of passengers on their ships, and these people were known as engagés. Engagés were basically hired craftsmen who had a 3-year contract to be with the company 100 Associates. And the idea here was that after the 3 years were up, because they had guaranteed jobs, the idea was that they would stay in France and start their lives there. Unfortunately for the company, these engagés, these hired men, once their contracts were up, actually returned to France instead of staying in the colony in New France, and so that was a strategy that also didn't work. So just to recap all of that, the church really kind of failed. Charter companies really kind of failed. Really, the only thing that worked was when the government put in the, Jean Talon's Fille du Roi strategy, and the whole ratio between men and women kind of evened out a little bit, and the natural birth rate grew, but it really just took too long, and by that time, the British were starting to come in, and you began to see the French regime sort of fall apart. All right, so by 1663, the King of France, who at that time was Louis XIV, he actually decided to place the colony of New France entirely under his direct authority. So he introduced the same model of government in his colony that was actually existed in the provinces of the mother country in France. So basically the king, he had all powers, and he appointed his ministers. And so he appointed his naval minister, who was responsible for the French colonies that exist all around the world. That minister then would appoint the Sovereign Council. Remember, the Sovereign Council in New France was the Governor General and the Intendant. Remember, the Governor General was responsible for external affairs. He organized defense as well as military offenses, and then the Intendant was the one who was responsible for internal affairs, which was like the police, military supplies, justice, finance. And keeping in mind, the Intendant was also the one who developed settlement, so the whole Fille du Roi thing. But here I'll give you guys an image of it just so that you can take another look at it, because it's been a while. So here it is. Okay, so there you have it. And there's the king, right? He appoints his naval minister, who then appoints the Sovereign Council, which are the Governor General, the Intendant. And so this whole design, this political structure, led to a lot of instability and inequality in society, because with this system came the social hierarchy that existed in New France. So you had the nobility, the clergy, and then the third estate. So the people living in New France, majority of them belonged to the third estate, so they weren't treated as well as nobility or clergy. And really the last thing I just want to touch on real quick is the fact that as this new political structure came in, there was all kinds of issues going on in New France at the time, and you began to see people move away from being called French, colonists, to Canadiens in the colony. Reason for that is that over time the colonists really developed their own culture that was distinct from that of France, and they having come into several regions in France and coming into contact with Aboriginal societies, the Canadiens settled in the St. Lawrence Valley, and so they were kind of a cross between some French culture, a little bit of Aboriginal culture. There was the whole the Acadians up in the northeastern Canada along the Maritimes, and so you just began to see this whole notion of a new culture emerge called the Canadien that was separate from France. Thanks a lot for watching our review video on our second unit, which was the French regime. I hope that this video was beneficial for you as you study for our end of year exam. Next video we'll be looking at the change of empire. That is when the British overtook the French for control of the colonies.